On the morning of October 10th, 1918, a Thursday, the RMS Linster pulled out of Kingstown Harbor on her regular mail run to Holyhead. Among the passengers were three women from the same household, a duke's daughter, a cook, and a servant. Lady Alexandra Phyllis Hamilton was 42 years old, unmarried, traveling with the quiet retinue that had become the fixed furniture of her life. Martha Bridge prepared her meals. Eleanor Strahan attended to her needs. They boarded a mailboat. They found their places. The Irish Sea was cold but crossable, and the crossing was one they had made before. Somewhere east of the Kish Bank, a German torpedo from UB-123 struck the ship on the port side. The hull ruptured. The Linster went down in minutes. 564 people died. Phyllis was one of them. Martha was another. Eleanor was a third. The sea took all three, and it did not give them back. The public knew the name Abercorn. It meant Ulster, 76,000 acres, a ducal title, baron's court, royal godparents, and a place at the center of British and Irish power that stretched back centuries. What the public did not know, what nobody outside the household could have seen, was that the woman who had built that family was, by the autumn of 1918, running out of children to bury. This is the story of Mary Anna Curzon-Howe, Duchess of Abercorn, who gave one of the grandest dynasties in Ireland 9 children across 20 years, and lost 7 of them. 4 in the nursery, 1 at Ypres, 1 in silence, and 1 on a mailboat in the Irish Sea 32 days before the war ended. But to understand how a daughter of Baronscourt came to die on a mailboat in the Irish Sea, how a family that had spent centuries arranging its own permanence could not protect the people inside it, you have to go back further than the morning of October 10th, 1918, further than the war that killed her brother, further than the father whose death began the unraveling. You have to go back to the valley in County Tyrone, to the marriage that brought Mary Anna Curzon-Howe into the Hamilton family, and to the long, careful construction of a dynasty so large, so deeply rooted in Irish land and British court life, that it seemed to exist beyond the reach of ordinary catastrophe. This is the story of the Abercorn Hamiltons, Dukes of Abercorn, masters of a baron's court, one of the highest-ranking aristocratic families in Ireland, and of the woman who gave that dynasty 9 children, buried most of them, and lived long enough to turn her daughters into memorial stone. The Abercorn name, by the time Mary married into it, meant something very specific in the vocabulary of British and Irish power. It meant Ulster. It meant acreage on a scale that most families could not conceptualize, let alone administer. It meant a ducal title created in 1868, a family seat that had been occupied since 1612, and a political presence so embedded in the governance of Ireland that the distinction between the family's private interests and the state's public authority had long since ceased to be meaningful. The Hamiltons were not merely aristocrats with an Irish estate. They were, in the way that mattered most in that world, part of the architecture of British rule itself. To understand what that meant, and what it would eventually demand from the children Mary raised inside it, you have to begin not with her, but with the generation that built the machine she inherited. The man who assembled the late Victorian version of the Abercorn dynasty was James Hamilton, first Duke of Abercorn. He had come into the marquisate young, and he used the decades that followed to construct exactly the kind of public identity that the British establishment most rewarded: reliable, visible, politically orthodox, and useful to the crown without being dangerous to it. He rose through conservative politics with the steady, unsurprising trajectory of a man whose chief talent was being precisely what was expected of him. He served twice as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, the crown's ceremonial representative in Dublin Castle, the man who embodied British sovereign authority on Irish soil. He entertained lavishly. He administered dutifully. He made himself, in the eyes of the court and the government, indispensable in the particular way that Anglo-Irish grandees were indispensable, not through brilliance, but through sheer social and territorial weight. The Lord Lieutenancy deserves a moment's attention because it explains the particular flavor of the Abercorn claim to power. The position was not executive in the modern sense. It was ceremonial, representational, and deeply symbolic. The man who held it stood for the crown in Ireland, hosted state functions at Dublin Castle, and embodied the argument that British governance of Ireland was legitimate, natural, and permanent. For a family already rooted in 70,000 acres of Ulster soil, the Lord Lieutenancy was not merely an honor. It was confirmation that the Abercorns were not simply living in Ireland, they were governing it. The distinction mattered. It meant that the family's children would grow up not merely wealthy and titled, but freighted with the assumption that their household existed in service to something larger than itself: the crown, the union, the order of things. That assumption would shape every life Mary's children led, and, for some of them, the manner in which they died. In 1868, Disraeli's government elevated the first duke from marquess to duke. A dukedom was the highest rank in the peerage, below royalty itself. It was, in the transactional language of Victorian honors, a reward for decades of political service and institutional loyalty. But in the language of this story, it was something more consequential. It was the final act of construction. The Abercorns were now at the summit of the Irish peerage, and everything that followed, the marriages, the children, the court appointments, the household arrangements, would be governed by the expectations that attached to a ducal title. A marquess could afford a quiet generation, a duke could not. The first duke had built a machine that required constant feeding: heirs to inherit, daughters to marry outward, sons to serve, a duchess to appear at court, an estate to be maintained, a name to be kept visible. He built it well. The question was what it would cost the people who had to keep it running after he was gone. His wife completed the design. Louisa Jane Russell was the daughter of the 6th Duke of Bedford, which meant that the Abercorn marriage connected two of the most powerful dynasties in the British Isles: the Hamiltons of Ulster to the Russells of Woburn, Tory territorial grandeur to the great Whig aristocratic tradition. Louisa understood, in the way that women of her rank were expected to understand without ever being taught explicitly, that a duchess's primary function was reproductive and strategic. Her household became a marriage factory of remarkable efficiency. Daughters were placed into high-ranking families with the precision of diplomatic appointments, each one a carefully negotiated transfer of rank, connection, and genetic material into another corner of the aristocratic network. Sons were channeled into politics, the military, or the court. No child was merely born. Every child was deployed. The operating principle was never stated because it never needed to be stated. Rank must be maintained. Alliances must be useful. Private feelings are secondary to the continuation of the name. If a daughter loved the wrong man, she learned not to. If a son wanted a life outside the regiment or the estate, he was reminded what he owed. The system was not cruel in the way a tyrant is cruel. It was cruel in the way that a well-designed institution is cruel. Impersonally, structurally, and with the absolute confidence that it was acting in everyone's best interest. That principle, visible in the first Duke's generation, perfected by Louisa, inherited by their son, is the machinery that Mary Anna Curzon-Howe married into on January 7th, 1869, at St. George's, Hanover Square. The system was already complete before she arrived. Her role was not to redesign it. Her role was to supply it with children. What she did not know, what nobody standing in that church could have known, was that the system would protect the name far more efficiently than it would protect the human beings who carried it. The scale of the estate must be made plain, because it explains the pressure that sat behind everything this family did. In the 1870s, the Duke of Abercorn's Irish holdings included almost 16,000 acres in Donegal and more than 47,000 acres in Tyrone, with Baronscourt as the center of an administrative world that employed agents, rent collectors, clerks, foresters, gamekeepers, gardeners, tenants, and domestic staff in numbers that resembled a minor government department more than a private household. By 1883, the second Duke, Mary's husband, held 76,500 acres across Tyrone and Donegal, with additional property in Scotland. The Abercorn papers, held in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, run to thousands of documents: deeds, rent rolls, maps, lease agreements, estate correspondence, stretching across centuries and covering properties in Tyrone, Donegal, Londonderry, Scotland, and London. This was not a family that merely had money. It had territory. It had jurisdiction. It had the kind of physical permanence that makes ordinary human fragility look like something that happens to other people. Baronscourt itself functioned as the visible proof of that permanence. The estate still describes itself as the home of the Duke of Abercorn's family since 1612. and the claim has barely altered across 4 centuries. A valley in County Tyrone, a great house, planting, landscape, continuity. The house had been rebuilt and expanded across generations, each version absorbing the tastes and ambitions of the Duke who commissioned it. But the essential message never changed. This place was here before you arrived. It will be here after you leave. The parkland ran to thousands of acres. The woodlands were managed on timescales that assumed the family would still be planting trees 100 years hence. The church on the estate grounds was not merely a chapel of convenience. It was the family's sacred geography, the place where children were baptized and marriages blessed, and eventually, where Mary would erect the memorials to the daughters she had lost. Everything at Baronscourt was designed to communicate duration to tenants, to neighbors, to visiting dignitaries, and most importantly, to the family's own children. To grow up there was to understand, before you could articulate it, that the house was more durable than any single life inside it. The valley endured, the title endured, the individual was temporary, the world surrounding the family was not stable, even if the estate made it look that way. The Abercorns had risen to their greatest prominence during the high Victorian era of Anglo-Irish landlord power, when the ownership of vast Irish acreage still conferred genuine political authority and social standing. A landlord of the second Duke's scale was not merely a private citizen with a large garden. He was a figure in the local economy, the local judiciary, the local church, and the local political imagination. Tenants paid rent to his agent. Magistrates deferred to his name. The Church of Ireland rector on the estate owed his living, in some measure, to the family's patronage. That kind of authority was not merely inherited, it was performed, maintained, and defended. And by the time Mary's children were growing up in the 1880s and 1890s, it was under sustained attack. The land war had convulsed the Irish countryside. Tenants were organizing, rents were being challenged. The long parliamentary struggle over Irish home rule had turned the governance of Ireland into the most divisive question in British politics. And families like the Abercorns, unionist to the core, committed to the maintenance of the union with Britain, their entire identity bound up in the argument that Ireland's future lay inside the United Kingdom, found themselves not merely defending their estates, but defending the political order that justified their existence. The dynasty was not collapsing, not yet, but the ground beneath it was shifting, and the generation Mary raised would be the one forced to navigate the transition from landlord authority to something narrower, harder, and more explicitly political. Her eldest surviving son would end up not as a great Irish landowner in the old sense, but as the first governor of Northern Ireland, a ceremonial role in a partition state, created from exactly the kind of upheaval the family had spent centuries trying to prevent. That is the world Mary entered. Not a family in crisis, but a family so thoroughly organized around its own continuation that crisis seemed structurally impossible. The estate was vast, the title was secure, the court connections were intimate, the future appeared arranged down to the last christening. And the quiet, devastating truth at the center of this story is that the arrangement worked precisely as it was designed to, and still could not save the children. Mary Anna Curzon-Howe was born on July 23, 1848, the daughter of Richard Curzon-Howe, 1st Earl Howe, and Anne Gore, whose own father was Admiral Sir John Gore. She came from a world that overlapped with the Abercorns without quite matching it, English rather than Anglo-Irish, naval rather than territorial, with a title that carried considerable prestige but not the sheer landed weight of a ducal house in Ulster. What she brought to the marriage was lineage, connection, and the unspoken expectation that she would do what women of her class were trained to do from girlhood: produce children, manage a great household, appear at court, support her husband's public life, and absorb whatever the dynasty required of her private self without audible complaint. She became in time a lady-in-waiting to Queen Alexandra, a role that placed her inside the innermost circle of royal domestic life and confirmed the family's proximity to the throne across 2 reigns. But in the context of this story, the court appointment matters less than what it concealed. The public saw a duchess in attendance on a queen. What the public did not see, because the public was never invited to see it, was a woman who spent the better part of 2 decades pregnant, who buried 4 infant sons before any of the public tragedies arrived, and whose emotional life was structured by a cycle of conception, birth, christening, hope, and burial that repeated with a regularity the outside world chose to treat as ordinary. The dynasty demanded heirs. Mary provided them. That the provision cost her 4 children before the name Abercorn appeared in a single wartime casualty list is the first private truth this story must establish. Her husband, James Hamilton, 2nd Duke of Abercorn, was born on August 24th, 1838, the eldest son of the first Duke, educated at Harrow and Christ Church, Oxford, the standard trajectory for an heir of his rank, and he moved through the expected stations with the measured confidence of a man for whom deviation had never been a serious possibility. Politician, courtier, diplomat, honorary colonel, landowner on a scale that placed him among the largest proprietors in the United Kingdom. He sat in the House of Lords as a matter of inheritance, not ambition. He served as chairman of the Great Northern Railway of Ireland because that was what men of his position did. They sat on boards, chaired companies, lent their names and their social authority to the commercial and administrative machinery of their world. He was not a battlefield figure. He was not a reformer. He was not a man whose name attached to controversy or passion. He was an institutional man, a man who embodied the family's public gravity through the accumulation of offices, duties, and appearances, rather than through any single dramatic act. And for his children, that steady, undramatic authority created a model that was almost impossible to challenge. The father did not need to be tyrannical. He merely needed to be present, and his presence was a lesson in itself. This is what an Abercorn looks like: dutiful, visible, connected to the crown, connected to the regiment, connected to the estate, never publicly uncertain, never visibly struggling. The question none of them could answer, because none of them were permitted to ask it, was what happened to the child who could not fill that shape, or the daughter for whom no shape had been designed at all. Their eldest surviving son, James Albert Edward Hamilton, was born on November 30th, 1869, barely 10 months after his parents' wedding, with the Prince of Wales as his godfather. He was educated at Eton, served in the military, and then built a long unionist political career in Ireland that would culminate in his appointment as the first governor of Northern Ireland in 1922. James Albert was the child the entire system existed to produce: the heir, the continuation, the son who could absorb the full symbolic and administrative weight of Baron's Court because every structure in the family, legal, financial, social, emotional, bent toward him from the moment he was born. His marriage in 1894 to Lady Rosalind Bingham, daughter of the 4th Baron Lucan, was itself a dynastic act. Another titled family drawn into the Abercorn orbit, another generation secured. The system functioned through him. The estate would pass to him. The title would rest on him. And that makes him essential to this story, not only as a political figure, but as the sibling against whom every other child's diminished options become legible. James Albert inherited everything. Everyone else inherited the duty to be useful or the permission to disappear. Lady Alexandra Phyllis Hamilton was born on January 23rd, 1876, with Queen Alexandra herself as one of her godmothers. That detail, the Queen's name given to the child, the royal sponsorship at the font, tells you everything about the family's social position and nothing at all about the girl who carried it. Phyllis never married. She remained within the orbit of family duty and aristocratic femininity, inhabiting the kind of life that the late Victorian and Edwardian world had quietly arranged for well-born daughters who did not find, or were not found by, a suitable husband. She was not scandalous. She was not defiant. She was simply present, inside the family, beside the family, useful to the family, a woman whose existence confirmed the household's completeness, without requiring the world to take particular notice of her. She was 42 years old when she boarded the RMS Linster on that October morning in 1918 with the family cook Martha Bridge and a servant Eleanor Strachan. 3 women from the Abercorn household crossing the Irish Sea on a mailboat. The titled daughter, the cook, and the maid. They died together. Lady Glattis Mary Hamilton was born on December 10th, 1880, and followed the path the family's machinery had prepared for its daughters. In 1902, she married Ralph Howard, 7th Earl of Wicklow, and produced a son. The continuation expected of her, the alliance completed. This was the classic dynastic transaction, a daughter redistributed through marriage into another titled family, her emotional life absorbed into the requirements of alliance and lineage. Glattis died in March 1917 at the age of 36. The public record is quieter about the circumstances of her death than about almost anything else in this story, and the script should respect that silence rather than fill it with invention. What matters is the timing. Gladys died a year before Phyllis. Mary lost both of her daughters in successive years, and the memorial she later erected inside the church at Barons Court, to both of them together in stone, is the act of a mother who had exhausted every other way of holding her children. Lord Arthur John Hamilton was born in 1883, educated at Wellington College, and commissioned into the Irish Guards, the regiment that placed him inside a tradition of aristocratic military service as old as the family's connection to the crown. He rose to captain and was appointed deputy master of the household, a court position that confirmed the pattern the Abercorn sons served. They served in uniform and they served at court, and the distinction between the two was less important than the principle that underlay both. A younger son of a ducal house did not choose his future. His future was chosen for him by the family's need to remain visible inside the institutions that mattered. Arthur accepted that visibility. He wore the uniform. He held the office. And at 30 years old, on November 6, 1914, during the First Battle of Ypres, he was killed. His name is inscribed on the Menin Gate, commemorated alongside the tens of thousands of men whose bodies were never recovered from the Flanders mud. The public language surrounding that memorial is sacrifice, honor, duty fulfill. The private arithmetic is simpler. Mary's son was dead. There was no body. There was no grave to visit. The memorial at Ypres is communal, one name among thousands. And the grief it represents is by design anonymous. Lord Claude Nigel Hamilton, the youngest of the 5 children who reached adulthood, was born in 1889. He served in the First World War, survived it, and then built a career that looked from the outside like a quieter and more durable version of the family template. He became a courtier, serving in the households of George V, Queen Mary, and eventually Elizabeth II, and he never married. He died in 1975 without issue. Claude Nigel is the son who survived by becoming useful to the institution that had shaped the family in the first place. He is not the heir. He is not the war dead. He is the younger brother who found a sanctioned role inside the system and held it steadily and without public drama for 6 decades. Whether that constitutes escape or a different form of absorption is one of the questions this story leaves open. And then there were the 4 who never had the chance to become anything at all. Claude Penn Alexander, born in 1871, dead in infancy. Charlie, born in 1874, dead in infancy. Claude Francis, born in 1878, dead in infancy. And an unnamed stillborn boy in 1886. 4 sons, born and lost before the family's visible tragedies began. They are not footnotes. They are the foundation of Mary's private experience of motherhood, a pattern of pregnancy and burial that the social world around her either did not notice or did not consider worth acknowledging publicly. The dynasty looked fertile. The nursery was unstable from the start. The family took its public shape with Mary's marriage at St. George's, Hanover Square, on January 7, 1869. A winter wedding in one of London's most fashionable churches. 2 powerful families joined. A bride of 20 entering one of the leading ducal houses in the British Isles. The day was ordered, bright, socially confident, the kind of event that confirmed to the watching world that the system was working, that rank was reproducing itself, that the future was in hand. The heir arrived that same year. James Albert Edward, born in November 1869, secured the succession almost immediately, and that single fact reorganized everything that followed. Once the heir existed, every later child entered a pre-written hierarchy. The eldest son was the future duke. The second son was the reserve. The spare, in the aristocratic vocabulary that did not soften the implications. The daughters were potential alliances, their value measured in the rank and connection of the husband who could be secured for them. And the children who died, as 4 of them would, were absorbed into the family's private bookkeeping without altering its public trajectory. A duke's nursery in this period was not a place of uncomplicated joy. It was the production floor of a dynasty, and the losses that occurred there were treated as operational setbacks rather than existential wounds. For a stretch of years that lasted perhaps a decade and a half, the household appeared to function with the seamless authority the outside world expected of it. Barons Court in season, the long Tyrone summers, the shooting calendar, the rhythm of a country estate where the parkland seemed to stretch beyond the horizon, and the domestic staff moved through a house whose corridors could swallow the sound of an entire nursery. London for the court calendar, the townhouse, the season, The drawing rooms where the Duchess was received as one of the most senior women in the peerage, royal godparents at christenings, the Prince and Princess of Wales personally connected to the family through sponsorship and friendship, a bond that elevated the Abercorns from merely grand to personally intimate with the future king. Military commissions arranged for the boys, marriage prospects quietly assessed for the girls, game, church, tenants, correspondence, the estate agent's monthly accounts, the forester's reports, the rector's requests. The ceaseless administrative rhythm of a household that governed tens of thousands of acres and hundreds of lives, operating as if the word crisis had been designed for lesser families. But the private record does not support the public image. By the time Mary had carried 9 pregnancies, 4 of her sons were dead. Claude Penn Alexander in 1871, barely 2 years after the wedding, barely a year after the heir's arrival. The first loss. The one that might, in a kinder world, have been absorbed as misfortune rather than portent. Then Charlie in 1874, then Claude Francis in 1878, then the unnamed stillborn boy in 1886. 4 sons, arriving across 15 years, each one christened or buried or both inside the household's private rhythms, each one a grief that the social calendar did not pause to acknowledge. There is something about that sequence that is worth sitting with for a moment. This was not a single catastrophe. It was a pattern, slow, repetitive, and invisible to anyone who was not inside the nursery. Mary was 38 years old by the time the last of these losses occurred. She had been producing children for the Abercorn name for 17 years. The 5 who survived were, by then, already being shaped by the family's expectations. The heir at Eton, the younger sons moving toward their commissions, the daughters learning the postures and silences that their world required. And their mother had buried 4 brothers those children would never know. The living family and the dead family existed inside the same house, separated by nothing more than the fact that one group had names on the nursery wall and the other had stones in a churchyard. There was no public language for what this cost Mary. There was no mechanism inside the world she inhabited for a duchess to say that the thing she had been asked to do, to bear children for one of the grandest houses in the kingdom, was producing funerals as reliably as it produced heirs. The christenings happened, the burials happened, and the social world around her continued to see what it preferred to see. Fecundity, duty performed, the continuation of the line. That pattern is where this story truly begins. Not with the war, not with the sinking, not with the spectacular public losses that would come later. It begins in the nursery at Baronscourt with a mother bearing sons in a house too large and too certain of its own permanence to notice that the woman at its center was already carrying a weight the title could not name. The public version of this family, the version that appeared in court records and society columns and christening announcements, was one of unbroken prosperity. The private version was something else entirely. It was a woman in her 20s, then her 30s, then approaching 40, producing children for a dynasty that absorbed the living ones into its hierarchy and the dead ones into its silence. If you had visited Baronscourt in 1890, you would have seen a great house at the height of its confidence. You would not have seen the 4 small graves. Outwardly, by the close of the 1880s, the Abercorn family appeared to have achieved everything the system was built to produce. The title was secure. The heir was healthy and growing. The daughters were being prepared for their futures. The estate was vast, profitable, and administratively sound. The court connections were as strong as any family in the kingdom could claim. The name meant exactly what it was supposed to mean. And inside that achievement, hidden beneath the photographs and the christening records and the court appointments, Mary had already buried 4 children, and the 5 who survived were growing up inside a house that valued their usefulness to the dynasty far more than their existence as individual human beings. The name was intact. The lives inside it were already under pressure, and the century was about to turn toward the kind of destruction that even 76,000 acres and a ducal coronet could not absorb. The years between the Diamond Jubilee and the turn of the century were, for a family like the Abercorns, a period of almost theatrical confidence. The empire was still expanding. The court calendar still governed the rhythms of social life for the families who mattered. The great estates of Ireland and England still functioned as private kingdoms, their owners moving between country seats and London townhouses, with the unhurried authority of people who had never been asked to justify their existence. And the Abercorns, by the 1890s, occupied a position inside that world that was as close to unassailable as the British aristocracy could offer. The second Duke was approaching the summit of his public career, not in the dramatic policy-shaping sense, but in the accumulative way that characterized men of his rank. He chaired boards, including the Great Northern Railway of Ireland. He attended the House of Lords. He served on committees whose work was administrative rather than controversial. He appeared at court with a regularity that confirmed his access without requiring him to exert himself beyond what convention demanded. He was, in the phrase the Edwardians would have understood instinctively, a man of weight, not because he said remarkable things, but because his presence in a room confirmed that the room was important. His wife, the dowager-to-be, was lady-in-waiting to Queen Alexandra, which placed the family inside the private domestic circle of the monarchy itself, not as political advisors or intimate confidants in the modern sense, but as part of the human furniture of royal life, the trusted, titled families who surrounded the sovereign as a matter of hereditary habit. Their eldest son, James Albert, had come down from Eton and entered the military, following the path that every Abercorn heir was expected to follow before settling into politics and estate management. In 1894, James Albert married Lady Rosalind Bingham, daughter of the 4th Baron Lucan, and the next generation of the dynasty began to take shape. The machine was reproducing itself, exactly as it had been designed to do. The social world the Abercorns inhabited during these years should not be imagined as static or merely comfortable. It was a performance, and the performance required constant maintenance. The London season demanded attendance, balls, dinners, levees, drawing rooms at the Palace, the Royal Academy, Ascot, the Opera. The Irish season demanded a different kind of visibility. Barons Court open for shooting parties. The estate functioning as a stage for the family's authority, the tenantry managed through agents whose reports arrived weekly. The church attended on Sundays. The local gentry entertained in a manner that confirmed the Abercorns' position at the top of Tyrone's social order. And between the seasons, the private life of the household continued. Children growing, tutors arriving and departing, letters written, mourning observed for the infant dead, christening celebrated for the living, the whole machinery of a great Anglo-Irish ducal house, turning over with the quiet, relentless regularity of an estate clock. For the daughters, the best years had a different texture, richer in some ways, narrower in others, and defined above all by the understanding that a daughter's value was transactional. Glattis, the elder of the two, had been brought up inside the household's expectation that she would marry well, and in 1902, at the age of 21, she did, wedding Ralph Howard, the 7th Earl of Wicklow, at a ceremony that completed the dynastic circuit the family required. Glattis produced a son. The alliance was sealed. She was no longer an Abercorn daughter waiting in the drawing room. She was the Countess of Wicklow, installed in another title household, her value to the dynasty fully realized through the act of marriage and the production of an heir for another family. Whether Glattis wanted that particular future, or any future shaped by those particular terms, is not something the record tells us. The record tells us only that she did what was expected of her, and that the family considered the matter settled. She was 21 years old. She had, by her family's definition, succeeded. Phyllis's story was different, and the difference was never acknowledged publicly because the social world the Abercorns inhabited had no vocabulary for it. She did not marry. The reasons are unrecorded, and the silence itself is instructive. In a family that tracked every alliance, every settlement, every christening, and every commission, with the precision of a military staff, the absence of a marriage for a duke's daughter is a conspicuous gap. Perhaps she chose not to marry. Perhaps no suitable match presented itself. Perhaps the family's own calculations. A daughter who was useful at home, who could attend to the aging duchess, who could accompany her mother at court functions and fill a seat in the carriage without requiring a settlement or a dowry negotiation, meant that Phyllis's unmarried state served the household's needs as efficiently as Glattis's marriage served its ambitions. Whatever the reason, the outcome was the same. By the early 1900s, Phyllis was settled into the role that the Edwardian social world had designed for well-born women who remained single, a life of family duty, charitable activity, and quiet, useful presence inside someone else's story. She was the daughter who stayed. In a house built around the heir, the daughter who stayed was both essential and invisible, always present, never quite the point. Arthur, meanwhile, had followed the path the family had laid for its younger sons with a directness that left no room for ambiguity or hesitation. Wellington College had shaped him in the way that Wellington shaped the sons of military and aristocratic families, not with the languid social confidence of Eton, but with a discipline that pointed unmistakably toward the regiment. Then the Irish Guards, the regiment most closely associated with Anglo-Irish aristocratic service, the regiment that placed him inside a tradition stretching back through generations of titled younger sons who had worn the uniform because the family required it and because no other path had been offered with equal conviction. Arthur served. He rose to captain. He was appointed deputy master of the household, a court position that kept the Abercorn name inside the palace machinery, even as the political world around the family was shifting beneath its feet. Arthur was a soldier and a courtier, and the two roles were not contradictory, but complementary. The family did not distinguish between serving the crown in uniform and serving the crown in a drawing room. Both were expressions of the same principle. An Abercorn son was useful or he was nothing. The estate would not be his. The title would never be his. What he could have was a role, defined by the family, sanctioned by the crown, visible enough to honor the name without competing with the heir. That was the bargain younger sons of ducal houses accepted, and Arthur accepted it without, so far as the record shows, public complaint. He was the good son. He was the dutiful son. He was the son who went where the family pointed and did not ask whether the pointing served his interests or only the dynasty's. Claude Nigel, the youngest, was still a boy during these years. Born in 1889, he was a decade behind Arthur and nearly 20 years behind the heir. His childhood at Baronscourt would have been shaped less by participation in the family's public life than by absorption of its atmosphere. The vast parkland, the servants' deference, the church on Sunday mornings, the slow Tyrone seasons turning from damp spring to shooting autumn, the knowledge, absorbed rather than taught, that this house and this valley and this name were the most important things in the world. He was the baby of the family. He was the child born after the last of the infant deaths, the son who arrived into a household that had already buried 4 of his brothers. Whether anyone ever sat the youngest Hamilton child down and told him plainly that 4 boys had come before him and not survived is unknowable. But the fact that Mary's last surviving son was born into a family already marked by nursery laws gives his later trajectory. The survival, the long career, the decades of quiet royal service, a particular and private residence. These were the best years because nothing on the surface was wrong. The heir was married and producing the next generation. 1 daughter had been successfully placed. The younger sons were in service. The estate was vast and functioning. The family's court connections were stronger than they had been in a generation. And if you had visited Baronscourt in, say, 1905 and walked the grounds and dined with the family and watched the household in its daily operations, you would have seen something that looked like a dynasty that had mastered the central challenge of aristocratic life, the transmission of wealth, rank, and purpose from one generation to the next, without interruption, without scandal, without any visible seam. But the surface was not the whole story. It never is. In families built on this scale, the first signs of trouble were not dramatic. They were structural, embedded in the family's design rather than caused by any single failure or decision. The Abercorn architecture created radically unequal futures for the children inside it. And by the early 20th century, those inequalities were becoming visible in a way that could no longer be absorbed into the household's general atmosphere of confidence and continuity. James Albert had everything. The heir's position was not merely one of privilege within the family, it was a complete identity. A man who knew from the age of consciousness that the estate, the title, the political role, and the social authority of the Abercorn name would all converge on him. He did not need to seek purpose. Purpose was his birthright. His marriage to Rosalind Bingham had produced children. His political career was advancing through the channels of Ulster Unionism, a world of Orange lodges, landed Protestantism, and parliamentary opposition to Home Rule that placed him at the center of the most consequential political argument in Irish life. He was becoming, by the early 1900s, the man the family had designed him to be. The next Duke of Abercorn, the inheritor of Baronscourt, the public face of one of the most powerful Anglo-Irish families in existence. Beside him, everyone else was diminished, not by cruelty, not by deliberate neglect, not by any conscious act of exclusion, by architecture. The system that elevated the heir necessarily reduced the others to supporting roles, and those roles were defined not by what the individual wanted, but by what the dynasty needed. Arthur needed to serve in uniform. Claude Nigel needed to serve at court. Glattis needed to marry into another title. Phyllis needed to remain available for whatever the household required of her. The family did not have to quarrel openly for the hierarchy to do its work. The structure itself administered the wounding, quietly, continuously, and with the full confidence of a system that had been operating on the same principles for centuries. There is something about that inequality that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains the emotional texture of everything that followed. When Arthur died at Ypres, the loss was devastating not only because he was young, not only because the war was brutal, not only because there was no body to bury, but because he had spent his entire life inside a system that valued him primarily for his usefulness. He had been useful in the regiment, he had been useful at court, he had been useful as a visible younger son of a ducal house, confirming by his presence in uniform that the Abercorns served the crown in every generation, and then the system that had defined his usefulness sent him to Flanders and killed him. The same logic that had given Arthur his commission had given him his death. And there was no language inside the Abercorn world, no framework, no vocabulary, no acceptable form of questioning that could name that connection without threatening the entire edifice on which the family's identity rested. The daughter's inequality was quieter, but no less complete. Glattis had been redistributed through marriage. She belonged now to the Wicklow household, her Abercorn identity folded into another family's requirements. She had done what was asked of her. She had married well. She had produced a son. She was by every metric her world recognized a success. And yet her success had taken her away from the family that had raised her and placed her inside a new set of obligations that were no more her own choosing than the first. Phyllis had not been redistributed. She remained at home inside the family orbit, performing the invisible, unrewarded work of aristocratic daughterhood. Attendance, companionship, charity, presence, the filling of spaces that would otherwise have been empty, without the compensatory status that marriage would have conferred. In a world that measured a woman's achievement by the rank of the husband she had secured, Phyllis had no achievement to display. She had only her availability. She had only the fact that she was still there. These inequalities were not unique to the Abercorns. Every aristocratic family of this period produced them. Primogeniture demanded them. The peerage system enforced them. The social world around them treated them as natural and inevitable. What made them matter in this particular story was their convergence with the catastrophes that were about to arrive. The system that had created unequal futures for Mary's children was about to be tested by war, death, and maritime disaster. And the children who had been given the least room to define themselves, the least space to build lives that belonged to them rather than to the name, would be the ones most completely consumed. The first fracture came on June 3rd, 1913, and it came not through scandal or war, but through the ordinary, inevitable mechanism that every dynasty must eventually confront. James Hamilton, second Duke of Abercorn, died. He was 74 years old. He had held the title for 28 years. He had been the center of the household, the authority around which every other life in the family was organized, the man whose presence at Barons Court and in the House of Lords and at court had given the whole structure its gravitational pull. And then he was gone. The death of a duke is never merely a private event. It is an administrative, legal, and social reorganization that begins before the mourning ends and continues long after the funeral flowers have been removed from the church. The title passes not by choice or deliberation, but by the automatic operation of law. The eldest son becomes the duke in the instant his father ceases to be one. There is no interval, there is no ceremony of acceptance. The succession happens, and then the consequences of the succession unfold across weeks and months. Solicitors consulted, agents informed, tenants notified, the estate's legal instruments reviewed, the will read, and its provisions set in motion. For Mary, the most immediate consequence was a change of title that carried an entire change of identity. She was no longer the Duchess of Abercorn. She was the Dowager Duchess, a designation that carried honor but diminished authority, a linguistic demotion wrapped in respectful language, a way of telling the world that the center of power had moved on. Mary, at 64, was no longer the woman at the heart of the Abercorn machine. She was the woman the machine had used and now gently set aside. Her son James Albert was the third duke. His wife Rosalind was now the duchess. Baronscourt's future belonged to the next generation, and Mary's role was to step back with the grace that her class and her era demanded of widows. She was to be dignified. She was to be present at family occasions. She was to be consulted on matters of sentiment and domestic tradition. And she was to understand, without anyone needing to say it explicitly, that the household was no longer hers to direct. The transition alone would have been enough to test any family. The death of the patriarch, the administrative reordering of an estate that stretched across tens of thousands of acres, the emotional rearrangement of a household in which every relationship had been calibrated around the man who was now gone. But the timing made the fracture deeper and more ominous than it might otherwise have been. The second Duke died in June 1913. 14 months later, Britain would be at war. And in the space between those two events, the Abercorn family existed in a kind of suspension, adjusting to one loss while the conditions for catastrophic losses were assembling just beyond the horizon. The new Duke settled into his role with the confidence of a man who had been prepared for it his entire life. James Albert had known since boyhood that Baron's Court and the title and the estate and the political responsibilities would all come to him. He had married accordingly. He had built his political career accordingly. He had positioned himself inside Ulster Unionism with the kind of patient, visible loyalty that his father and grandfather had shown toward conservative politics and the crown. The transition was, in administrative terms, smooth. The estate continued to function. The rents continued to be collected. The agents continued to report. The household continued to operate. If you watched only the paperwork, you would have concluded that the Abercorn machine had absorbed the loss of its patriarch without a tremor. But a family is not paperwork. And the loss of the second Duke removed something from the household that no administrative continuity could replace. It removed the last layer of insulation between Mary's children and the world that was coming for them. While the father was alive, the family had a center that was older than the children, more authoritative than the children, and, crucially, responsible for the children in a way that the children were not yet responsible for each other. The Duke was the axis around which the household turned. His death shifted that axis to the heir, and in doing so, it exposed every other member of the family to a new and less protected position. Arthur was no longer the younger son under his father's authority. He was the younger brother of a duke. A different relationship entirely, carrying different obligations and a different emotional weight. The daughters were no longer the daughters of a living duke. They were the sister of one. And Mary was no longer the wife. She was the mother, the widow, the dowager, the woman whose role was now defined entirely by what she had once been and by what she had produced. In the space between those two events, the Abercorn family existed in a kind of suspension. The new Duke was settling into his title. The estate was adjusting to its new master. Mary was adjusting to widowhood. Arthur was still in uniform, still serving, still the younger son whose purpose was defined by the regiment and the court. Claude Nigel was still the youngest, still finding his footing. Glattis was in the Wicklow household. Phyllis was still at home, still unmarried, still inside the family orbit. Everyone was where the system had placed them, and the system itself was about to be struck by a force it had never been designed to withstand. What the second Duke's death did in retrospect was remove the last layer of protection between Mary's children and the world that was coming. While the father was alive, the family had a center. The children could define themselves in relation to his authority, and accepting it, orbiting it, serving it, once he was gone, each of them stood more exposed. The heir had the title and the estate. The others had only the roles the family had assigned them. And those roles were about to be tested by a war that did not distinguish between the Duke of Abercorn's heir and the Duke of Abercorn's younger son, between the daughter who had married well and the daughter who had stayed home, between the child who mattered to the succession and the child who did not. Mary was 64 years old. She had already buried 4 infant sons and a husband. She had watched her surviving children sorted into a hierarchy that valued some of them far more visibly than others. She had spent her life inside a system designed to perpetuate a name, and the name had survived everything so far: infant death, political upheaval, the slow erosion of the landed world, the transition from one duke to the next. What it had not yet survived was a European war, and the war was coming for her children. The consequences of the second Duke's death rippled through the family in ways that were both immediate and slow burning. The immediate change was administrative and visible. James Albert was now the Duke, Rosalind was now the Duchess, and the household at Baron's Court began the process of recalibrating itself around a new center of authority. Letters were written, accounts were transferred. The estate agent now reported to the third Duke. The servants now took their instructions from the new Duchess. The rhythms of a great house continued, but they continued around a different axis, and everyone inside the household from the dowager to the youngest footman, could feel the shift. The slow-burning change was emotional and harder to trace in any public record, but its effects would become visible in everything that followed. Mary had been the Duchess for over 40 years, the woman who hosted shooting parties, who attended court, who managed the domestic life of one of the grandest Anglo-Irish houses in the kingdom, who had borne 9 children for the dynasty and buried 4 of them within its walls. Now she was the dowager. The world still treated her with deference, but the deference was retrospective. It honored what she had been, not what she currently was. And for a woman who had given her entire adult life to the maintenance of the Abercorn name, the shift from Duchess to Dowager was not merely a change of title. It was a change of purpose. The machine she had served no longer needed her at its center. It had her son. It had her son's wife. It had the next generation. Mary's utility was exhausted. For the surviving children, the father's death altered the family's internal atmosphere in ways that are difficult to reconstruct from public sources alone, but easy to recognize from the patterns of aristocratic succession. The authority figure was gone. The next generation was in charge, and the siblings who had grown up inside the old hierarchy were now navigating a new one in which the heir's ascension to the dukedom widened the gap between his position and everyone else's into an unbridgeable chasm. James Albert was no longer the eldest son preparing to inherit. He was the Duke of Abercorn, master of Baronscourt, holder of 76,000 acres, and the most prominent unionist figure in Tyrone. Arthur was no longer the younger son whose future his father might help to shape. He was the younger brother of a duke, still in the Irish Guards, still serving, still defined by a role that the family had written for him before he was old enough to consent to it. The political world around the family was darkening too, and not only because of events gathering on the continent. In Ireland, the Home Rule crisis had reached a pitch of intensity that made the question of Irish self-governance feel not like a distant constitutional debate, but like an imminent threat to everything the Abercorn world represented. The Ulster Unionist Council was organizing resistance. Edward Carson was rallying Protestant Ulster against the prospect of a Dublin parliament. The Ulster Volunteer Force was drilling, and the possibility of armed confrontation between Unionists and Nationalists, between two visions of what Ireland was and who it belonged to, hung over the political landscape like a weather system that would not break. The family's unionism was not a casual political preference that could be adjusted in response to changing circumstances. It was existential. The Abercorns' wealth, their authority, their social position, their identity as an Anglo-Irish ducal house, all of it depended on the continuation of the union with Britain. Home Rule, if it came, would not merely change the governance of Ireland. It would delegitimize the family's reason for being. Baronscourt was not simply a country house in a beautiful valley. It was a unionist outpost, and in the years immediately before the war, it was a unionist outpost under political siege. Records survive from the military archives in Dublin for a proposed arms raid on Baronscourt during the Revolutionary period, a plan that, whatever its operational outcome, tells you something important about how the estate was perceived by those outside the Abercorn world. It was a symbol, it was a target. And the family inside it was not merely mourning a patriarch and adjusting to a new duke. It was facing the possibility that the entire political settlement on which 3 centuries of Abercorn power rested might be about to collapse. That is the frame in which everything that follows must be understood. When Arthur went to France in the autumn of 1914, he went not merely as a British officer doing his duty, but as the younger son of a family whose relevance was already being contested on its own doorstep. He went carrying the weight of a name that demanded service, a political world that was beginning to question whether the name deserved the authority it claimed, and a personal history shaped entirely by the family's expectation that he would be useful. He had been useful at Wellington. He had been useful in the Irish Guards. He had been useful as deputy master of the household. And now he was going to be useful on the Western Front, because that was what younger sons of ducal houses did when the country went to war. They served. And some of them did not come back. Mary was 65 years old when the war began in August 1914. She had already buried 4 infant sons and a husband. She had watched her surviving children sorted into a hierarchy that valued some of them as irreplaceable and others as merely serviceable. She had spent her entire adult life inside a system designed to perpetuate a name, and the name had survived everything so far: infant death, political upheaval, the slow erosion of the landlord world, the transfer of a title from one generation to the next. What it hadn't yet survived was a European war. And the war was coming not for the name. Names survive wars. That is what they are designed to do. But for her children, for the specific, individual, irreplaceable human beings she had carried and raised and watched grow into the roles the family had assigned them, the father was gone. The new duke was installed. The mother was a widow. The daughters were where the family had placed them. And the youngest son, who had ever worn an Abercorn uniform, was about to meet the Western Front. That stability would last 14 months, and then it shattered. The war, when it came quickly for the Abercorns. Not in the sense that the family was caught unaware. The political crisis in Ireland had already familiarized them with the idea of armed conflict. The household's deep connections to the military meant that the mobilization of August 1914 was felt immediately and personally inside Barons Court. And the unionist world the family inhabited had been preparing, in its own way, for a confrontation that many believed would come on Irish soil rather than in Belgium. It came quickly in the sense that the gap between peacetime confidence and wartime catastrophe was, for this family, astonishingly short. 14 months separated the second Duke's death from the outbreak of war. 5 months separated the outbreak of war from the death of his son. The family had barely finished adjusting to one loss when the next one struck. Arthur went to France with the Irish Guards in the autumn of 1914. Part of the first wave of the British expeditionary force that crossed the Channel, expecting, in many cases, a short campaign. A war that would be decided by Christmas, settled by professional soldiers in a few decisive engagements, and concluded before the full weight of industrialized killing had time to manifest. Arthur would have known better than most civilians what he was walking into. He was a professional officer. He had trained for this. The Irish Guards were among the finest infantry regiments in the British Army, and their officers were expected to lead from the front, to be visible, to be steady, to set the example that the men behind them needed. That expectation was not merely a matter of regimental tradition. It was a death sentence for a disproportionate number of junior officers in the war's first months, when the tactics of the previous century met the firepower of the present one. Arthur was 30 years old. He was a captain. He was the deputy master of the household, a court appointment that meant nothing in a Belgian field but everything about the world he had come from. He was the youngest son of a duke, carrying a name that was recognized in every officer's mess in the army. And he was also, in the way that mattered most to the men he led, simply another officer walking forward into ground that was being contested yard by yard across the waterlogged flatlands of Flanders. The First Battle of Ypres, which began in October 1914 and ground on into November, was the engagement that ended the war's brief phase of movement and inaugurated the static, attritional horror of trench warfare. The British Expeditionary Force was outnumbered. The fighting was close, chaotic, and devastatingly costly. Entire battalions were reduced to fragments. The Irish Guards, Arthur's regiment, were in the thick of it, holding positions, counterattacking, absorbing casualties at a rate that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had imagined the war in the terms of the previous century's colonial campaigns. Arthur was killed on November 6, 1914. The circumstances of his death are not recorded with the kind of intimate detail that a documentary would ideally want. No letter survives, so far as the public record shows, describing the moment itself. No eyewitness account that placed Arthur in a specific trench at a specific hour. What is known is this: he died during the battle, his body was never recovered, and his name was later inscribed on the Minnan Gate at Ypres, the memorial that bears the names of nearly 55,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers who fell in the Ypres salient and have no known grave. Arthur Hamilton is one name among thousands on that wall. The memorial does not distinguish between dukes' sons and laborers' sons. It simply records the fact that these men went into the ground and did not come back, and that nobody knows precisely where they are. The news reached Barons Court in the way that such news reached every household in Britain and Ireland during the autumn of 1914. By telegram, by official notification, by the arrival of words on paper that converted a living son into a name on a casualty list. Mary was 66 years old. She had buried 4 infant sons. She had buried her husband 18 months earlier, and now she was being told that her adult son, the son she had raised, the son she had watched grow into his uniform and his court appointment, the son who had done everything the family asked of him, was dead in Belgium. There was no body to bring home. There was no grave to visit. There was only the official language of military loss, killed in action, no known grave, commemorated on the memorial, and the private reality of a mother who had now lost 5 of her 9 children. The public response was dignified and institutional, as the public response to aristocratic war dead always was in the early months of the conflict. Arthur was honored. His service was noted. His sacrifice was folded into the larger narrative of national duty and noble obligation that the war's early months still permitted. The Irish Guards recorded his death in their regimental history. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission would later maintain his commemoration on the Minnan Gate. The family's grief was acknowledged in the court circular and the obituary columns with the restrained, formulaic language that the British establishment used to process the deaths of its own. A brave officer, a devoted servant of the crown, a son who had given his life for his country. None of that language touched what the loss actually meant inside the family. Arthur's death did not merely remove one person from the household. It altered the emotional architecture of every relationship that remained. It changed what it meant to be the surviving brother, the surviving sister, the surviving mother. It changed the weight that every subsequent family gathering would carry. The empty chair, the name that could not be mentioned without invoking the Menin Gate, the knowledge that the family's culture of service had produced exactly the outcome that service was supposed to prevent. The heir, James Albert, was now the Duke whose younger brother had been killed in the war's first autumn, a man whose own survival carried for the rest of the conflict the particular and uncomfortable weight of being the brother who stayed behind. Dukes were not sent to the front line. The peerage system, for all its emphasis on military tradition and noble sacrifice, operated on the unspoken understanding that the heir to a great title was too valuable to risk in a trench. James Albert served the war effort through politics and administration, through his unionist connections and his position in Irish public life. He did not serve it by standing in a field in Belgium waiting for a shell. Whether James Albert felt guilt about that disparity, or relief, or simply the grinding daily awareness that the family's hierarchy had placed him behind a desk in Ulster, while it placed Arthur behind a parapet in Flanders, is not something the public record reveals. But the structural fact is unavoidable. The system that had made James Albert the heir had also made Arthur the expendable son, the son whose value lay in service rather than in inheritance, the son who could be sent to the Western Front because the dynasty did not depend on his survival in the way it depended on the heirs. The system had not fired the bullet that killed Arthur, but the system had built the life that put him in the bullet's path, and it had done so with the calm, ancient, impersonal logic that governed everything the Abercorn family did. For the women in the family, Arthur's death created a different kind of alteration. Less visible, perhaps, but no less consequential in the way it reshaped the household's emotional interior. Phyllis was no longer simply the unmarried daughter living within the family orbit. She was now the unmarried daughter in a house that had been marked by war death. The household she inhabited had changed its character overnight, and the change was not merely atmospheric. Before November 1914, Baronscourt was a great Anglo-Irish estate adjusting to a new duke, a house in the ordinary process of generational transition, looking forward, settling in. After November 1914, it was a house in mourning, and not the gentle, expected mourning that had followed an elderly patriarch's passing after a full life, but the sharp, unnatural mourning that followed the killing of a young man who should, by every assumption of the pre-war social world, have had decades of service and life ahead of him. The black crepe had barely been put away for the father when it had to be brought out again for the son. Glattis in the Wicklow household absorbed the news as a sister, separated from her family by marriage and geography. She had her own household, her own son, her own obligations to the Wicklow title. But she was still an Abercorn daughter, and the death of her brother drew the two families' grief together in a way that no amount of dynastic separation could prevent. A brother's death at Ypres does not observe the boundaries that marriage settlements create. It reaches into every household where the dead man was loved, and it stays. Claude Nigel, the youngest surviving son, was 25 years old when Arthur was killed. He was himself in military service. The war had claimed both remaining Hamilton brothers simultaneously, drawing them into the machinery of destruction that the family's culture of duty and the peerage's military traditions had prepared them for since boyhood. Claude Nigel's regiment, his specific wartime postings, and the details of his service are less prominently recorded in the public sources than Arthur's, in part because he survived, and survivors generate less commemorative documentation than the dead. What is known is that he served, that he endured, and that he came through the war alive. That survival, the simple, unadorned fact that one brother lived while the other did not, would shadow the rest of Claude Nigel's long life in ways that are easy to imagine and impossible to confirm from the public record alone. The difference between the two brothers' fates was determined by nothing more significant than the accidents of a wartime deployment. Which battalion was sent to which sector? Which officer stood in which position on which morning? Which shell fell 3 yards to the left rather than 3 yards to the right? Claude Nigel did not choose to survive any more than Arthur chose to die. The war simply used them differently, and the difference was permanent. He did not speak about it publicly. So far as the surviving record shows, he did what Abercorn sons were trained to do. He continued to serve. He carried whatever he carried in silence, inside the posture of duty that his family and his class and his aura had made available to him as the only acceptable response to the unbearable. He would outlive Arthur by 61 years. He would spend those years in royal service, quiet, unmarried, childless, useful, present. Whether those years felt like reprieve or penance is something only Claude Nigel ever knew, and he did not, so far as the public record shows, choose to share it. Mary, in those first months after Arthur's death, inhabited a grief that had no adequate public expression and no private outlet that her world would have considered appropriate. She was the Dowager Duchess of Abercorn. She was a woman of rank, of court connection, of social visibility. She was expected to grieve with dignity, to wear mourning, to accept condolences, to attend memorial services, to contribute to the regimental funds, and to conduct herself in a manner that honored her son's sacrifice, without embarrassing the family through excessive or uncontrolled displays of emotion. That was the bargain her class offered to bereaved mothers. You may grieve, but you must grieve within the forms we have provided, and those forms must never suggest that the sacrifice was anything other than noble. The problem with that bargain, and it is the problem at the center of this entire story, is that the forms of noble grief do not actually address the experience of losing a child. They address the experience of witnessing someone else lose a child. They are designed for the audience, not for the mother. The memorial service comforts the attendees. The regimental honor comforts the regiment. The inscription on the Menin Gate comforts the nation. The mother is left with the fact, the bare, unreducible fact, but that her son is dead and there is no grave, and the last time she saw him he was alive, and now he is not, and no amount of ceremony will change that. Mary had already learned, through the infant deaths that preceded everything else in this story, that grief in her world was something to be absorbed rather than expressed. She had already practiced the art of continuing, of attending court functions after burying a child, of carrying a pregnancy while mourning a son, of presenting to the world the image of a duchess performing her duty, while the private reality was something rawer and more exhausting than the image permitted. Arthur's death did not teach her grief. It merely confirmed that grief was the one subject in which she had been given the most practice and the least help. And the next was coming. Lady Glattis Mary Hamilton, the Countess of Wicklow, the daughter who had been successfully redistributed through marriage, the sister who had done everything the family required of her and had been rewarded with a title, a household, and a son of her own, died on March 12, 1917. She was 36 years old. Her son was 15. The public record offers less detail about Glattis's death than about almost any other event in this story. The cause is not prominently documented in the biographical sources that survive. The circumstances are not narrated with the specificity that Arthur's death at Ypres or Phyllis's death on the Linster can be reconstructed from military and maritime records. Glattis died, and the record notes the fact without elaborating on it. And the absence of elaboration is itself a kind of evidence. In the Edwardian and Georgian world that the Abercorns inhabited, certain deaths were spoken about freely. Deaths in battle, deaths from recognized illness, deaths that carried public honor. And certain deaths were not, and the deaths that were not spoken about were often the ones that carried the heaviest private freight. Illness that was considered shameful. Circumstances that resisted the family's preferred narrative of duty and dignity. Losses that the household preferred to absorb in silence rather than expose to the public scrutiny that would inevitably follow a more detailed account. This script will not speculate where the record is silent. that silence belongs to Glattis and to the family that chose to maintain it. What the script will do is note the structural devastation of the timing. Glattis died in March 1917. Arthur had been dead for 2.5 years. The war was in its third year, with no end in sight. The great battles of the Somme and Verdun had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives in the preceding 12 months, and the conflict had settled into a grinding, industrial pattern of attrition that bore no resemblance to the brief, decisive campaign that the war's architects had promised. Mary, at 68, had now lost a husband, a son killed in combat, and a daughter whose death the record declines to illuminate. She had also, across the preceding decades, buried 4 infant sons. The arithmetic was becoming almost impossible to hold in the mind without flinching. Of the 9 children Mary had carried and delivered for the Abercorn dynasty, 6 were now dead. 3 remained: the Duke, the unmarried daughter, and the youngest son still in uniform. The memorial that Mary later erected inside the church at the Baron's Court estate, to Glattis and to Phyllis, both of them named together, both of them commemorated in stone by their mother, is one of the most quietly devastating details in this entire story. It was not unusual in the period for bereaved families to commission memorials inside private chapels and estate churches. The practice was widespread among the landed classes, and it served a function that was both devotional and social, a way of honoring the dead, of marking their place inside the family's sacred geography, of ensuring that the people who worshipped in the estate church would see the names and remember. But there is something about a mother commissioning a memorial to her own daughters that exceeds the social convention and enters a territory that no amount of ecclesiastical language can make comfortable. This was not a widow honoring a husband. This was not a son commemorating a father. This was a woman who had outlived her children, arranging for the evidence of that fact to be cut into the wall of the family church. The stone would endure, the daughters would not. And Mary would have to sit in the building week after week and look at what she had commissioned. A permanent physical record of something that should never have happened and could not be undone. The memorial also tells you something about the geography of grief in a family like the Abercorns. Arthur's name was on the Menin Gate, a public memorial shared with tens of thousands located in Belgium, impossible for an aging mother in County Tyrone to visit casually. The infant sons were buried somewhere on or near the estate, their graves absorbed into the churchyard's quiet collection of Hamilton dead. But Glattis and Phyllis would have their names inside the church itself, inside the building where the family worshipped, inside the space that was most intimately the Abercorns' own. Mary could not bring her daughters back, but she could ensure that the place where the family gathered to pray would never be a place where the family forgot. The loss of Glattis also narrowed the family in a way that went beyond the arithmetic of grief. Before March 1917, the surviving adult children numbered 4: James Albert, Phyllis, Glattis, and Claude Nigel. After Glattis, there were 3, and those 3 occupied radically different positions in relation to both the family and the war. The Duke was safe. James Albert's war was political rather than military. He was building the unionist networks and institutional relationships that would, within 5 years, see him appointed as the first governor of Northern Ireland. His trajectory was upward even as the family around him contracted. He was gaining authority, gaining public stature, gaining the kind of political visibility that would define the rest of his life. And he was doing it against a backdrop of sibling loss that he could not prevent and could not, within the conventions of his world, publicly grieve beyond the accepted forms. A duke did not collapse. A duke managed. A duke continued. Claude Nigel was still in uniform, still at risk, still inside the military machine that had already consumed his brother. Every day he survived was a day that could have ended differently. He had no estate waiting for him. He had no political career in preparation. He had only the role the family had assigned him, service, and the hope, which was not guaranteed, that the war would end before the role killed him as it had killed Arthur. Claude Nigel's war was the younger son's war, unprotected by the family's hierarchy, uninsured by the dynasty's investment in his survival, carried through entirely on the basis of luck and the movements of units across a map he could not control. And Phyllis was still at home, still unmarried, still moving through the narrowing world that the war had made of aristocratic female life. Fewer social occasions, fewer servants, fewer of the rituals that had once given structure to a well-born woman's year. She was 41 years old in the spring of 1917, and the life she inhabited had been defined almost entirely by absence. The absence of a husband, the absence of children, the absence of a trajectory that belonged to her rather than to the family's needs. She was the daughter who stayed, and now she was staying in a house that had lost more of its children than it had kept. By the spring of 1917, the Abercorn family's story had acquired a shape that no amount of public composure could disguise. It was the shape of a family being thinned out, not by a single catastrophe, not by a fire or a shipwreck or a plague that struck the household in one devastating blow, but by a succession of losses that arrived separately across years, each one absorbed into the family's silence before the next one came. The infant sons in the nursery, the husband in old age, the younger son in the Ypres salient, the married daughter in circumstances the record will not name. Each loss was distinct. Each was grieved in its own time, and together they formed a pattern that was becoming impossible to deny. The dynasty was consuming the woman who had spent her life feeding it children. The war ground on through the summer and autumn of 1917 and into the terrible winter that followed. The Third Battle of Ypres, Passchendaele, added another 250,000 British casualties to the toll, and the name Ypres, which already carried Arthur's death inside it, became synonymous with a scale of feudal destruction that defied the language of noble sacrifice. In Ireland, the political landscape was shifting beneath the Abercorns' feet with a velocity that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. The Easter Rising of 1916 had transformed the terms of the Irish question. The executions that followed had radicalized a generation. Sinn Féin was ascendant. The old constitutional nationalism of Redmond and the Home Rule Party was collapsing, replaced by a republicanism that was younger, more militant, and less inclined to negotiate than anything the pre-war unionist world had confronted. The certainties that the Abercorns depended on, the assumption that Ulster's place within the United Kingdom was settled and permanent, were under attack from forces that could not be managed by traditional methods of landlord authority and parliamentary maneuver. The world the Abercorns had been built to dominate was fracturing in ways that the dynasty's founders could not have imagined. And inside that fracturing world, Mary sat with her grief and her 3 remaining children and waited for the war to end. Then 1918 came, bringing with it the war's final convulsions. Claude Nigel survived. Month by month, engagement by engagement, the youngest Hamilton's son continued to come through the conflict alive. The Duke continued his political work in Ulster, his attention increasingly fixed on the post-war constitutional settlement that would determine the future of the province, and with it the future of the Abercorn position within it. And Phyllis continued her quiet, dutiful existence within the family orbit. Still in Ireland, still unmarried, still moving between the Abercorn households with the modest retinue of servants that her position entitled her to and her solitary life required. The household cook, Martha Bridge, and a servant, Eleanor Strachan, were part of the small female world that surrounded Phyllis in the absence of a husband or children of her own. These were the women she traveled with, ate with, relied upon, not as intimates in the way the modern world uses the word, but as the human framework of a titled woman's daily existence. In the aristocratic households of this period, the relationship between a well-born woman and her domestic staff was both closer and more hierarchical than any modern equivalent captures. Martha Bridge cooked Phyllis's meals. Eleanor Strachan attended to her personal needs. They were the constant, quiet presences in a life that had been defined decade by decade by the absence of the people who should have been closer. A husband, children, siblings who were still alive. The 3 women formed a unit, small and self-contained, that moved through the Abercorn world with the modest regularity of people who knew their place and their route and their purpose. They were the people Phyllis was with. They were the people Phyllis would die with. By the autumn of 1918, the war was entering what would prove to be its final phase, though nobody experiencing it from the perspective of an Irish household could have known that with certainty. The Great German Spring Offensive had been launched and turned back. The Allied forces were advancing along the Western Front. The Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires were in various stages of collapse. Germany's military position was deteriorating by the week. The end was coming, but the end had been reportedly coming before, in the optimistic projection that preceded each new offensive, and the cross-channel routes between Ireland and Britain were still operating under wartime conditions. German submarines still patrolled the Irish Sea. Naval convoys still provided what protection they could. The constant low-level danger that attended every maritime crossing in a war zone had become, for the people who made those crossings regularly, a fact of life absorbed into the ordinary calculations of travel. You boarded the boat, you made the passage, You arrived on the other side or you did not. And most of the time, nearly every time, you did. In early October 1918, Phyllis prepared to travel from Ireland to Britain. The route was the Kingstown to Holyhead mail boat, the RMS Linster, operated by the City of Dublin Steam Packet Company, a familiar vessel on a familiar crossing that thousands of passengers took each month without incident. She was accompanied by Martha Bridge and Eleanor Stragan, three women from the Abercorn household, boarding a mail boat on a Thursday morning in early autumn, the daughter of a duke, the family cook, and a servant. They carried whatever luggage the journey required and whatever domestic arrangements their destination demanded. They had no reason to believe the crossing would be anything other than what it had been every other time they had made it. Uneventful, routine, a few hours on the water between Ireland and Britain, between one part of the empire and another. Mary had now lost a husband, 4 infant sons, an adult son at Ypres, and a daughter in circumstances the family chose to absorb in silence. 7 of her 9 children were dead. She had 2 sons remaining, the Duke and Claude Nigel, and 1 daughter. Phyllis was 42 years old. The armistice was 3 weeks away, and somewhere beneath the surface of the Irish Sea, between Kingstown and the open water, a German torpedo from UB 123 was already traveling toward the hull of the mailboat that carried the last of Mary's daughters. The morning of October 10th, 1918 was a Thursday. The RMS Linster was scheduled to depart Kingstown, the harbour town south of Dublin that would later be renamed Dunlogair, on her regular mail run to Holyhead on the Welsh coast. It was the most ordinary crossing imaginable. The Linster had been making the passage for years, operated by the City of Dublin Steam Packet Company as part of the daily postal and passenger service that connected Ireland to Britain. She was not a grand liner. She was not a warship. She was not a vessel whose name anybody would have remembered unless something had gone wrong. She was a mail boat, a functional working ship designed for the mundane, essential business of carrying letters, parcels, and passengers across a stretch of water that was narrow enough to be completed in a few hours and wide enough, in wartime, to hide a submarine beneath its surface. The ship had a modest complement for the crossing. Estimates of the total number of people aboard vary, but the figure most commonly cited places it in the range of 700 to 800. Passengers, crew, and military personnel combined. Among the military passengers were soldiers returning to duty, servicemen on leave, members of the Royal Engineers Postal Section, and various other personnel attached to the war effort. Among the civilians were the usual cross-channel travelers, people with family on the other side, people with business to attend to, people making journeys they had made before without incident and expected to make again. The passengers who boarded the Linster that morning were, for the most part, the kind of people who treated the crossing as routine. They did not board with ceremony. They did not board with the sense that they were doing something remarkable or dangerous. They boarded a mailboat, found their places, and waited for the departure as they had waited for countless departures before. Among them were 3 women from the Abercorn household: Lady Alexandra Phyllis Hamilton, aged 42, Martha Bridge, the family cook, and Eleanor Strahan, a servant. They boarded together, as they would have traveled together anywhere, a small domestic unit attached to a titled woman, moving through the world with the quiet practiced coordination of people who had made this kind of journey before and who understood their respective roles within it. Phyllis was the mistress, Martha was the cook, Eleanor was the servant. The hierarchy was clear, and it would have been maintained even in the informality of a mailboat crossing. Separate accommodations, perhaps, or at least the understood distances that service imposed even at close quarters. Phyllis's reasons for the crossing are not recorded with the specificity a biographer would want. The public sources do not tell us whether she was visiting someone in England, attending to a family obligation, returning from one, or simply making one of the routine journeys that a woman of her position made between Ireland and Britain as a matter of unremarkable course. What the sources tell us is that she was there, on the boat on that morning, with those 2 women beside her, the daughter of a duke, the cook, and the maid. 3 women on a mailboat, crossing the Irish Sea in the last weeks of a war that had already taken Phyllis's brother at Ypres, and, the year before that, her sister Glattis. The Linster departed at Kingstown that morning and headed out into Dublin Bay, following the route she had followed hundreds of times before. The weather was not extreme. The sea was not calm, but it was not dangerous. The ship carried, in addition to her civilian passengers and crew, a significant number of military personnel, soldiers, sailors, and postal staff associated with the war effort. The exact passenger manifest would become a matter of agonized reconstruction in the weeks and months that followed, because what happened next destroyed the ship's records along with the ship. The submarine was UB-123, a German coastal U-boat operating in the Irish Sea under the command of Oberleutnant zur Robert Ram. She had been patrolling the approaches to Dublin Bay, waiting for targets in one of the busiest shipping lanes in the British Isles. The Leinster, steaming outward from Kingstown into the open sea, was precisely the kind of target that the U-boat campaign had been designed to strike. A vessel carrying mail and military personnel, operating on a regular schedule along a known route, vulnerable and predictable. The first torpedo was fired as the Linster made her way through the water east of the Kish Bank. It missed or struck without delivering a fatal blow. Accounts differ, and the chaos of the event makes precise reconstruction difficult. What is not in dispute is that the Leinster's master, Captain William Birch, attempted to turn the ship back toward Kingstown, toward the safety of the harbor and the shore. He did not have time. The second torpedo struck the Leinster on the port side forward, and the detonation was devastating. The mailboat's hull, designed for peacetime crossings, built to carry letters and passengers and livestock, not to absorb the concentrated force of a warhead, ruptured. The sea entered the ship. What followed was the kind of scene that maritime disaster produces with a terrible mechanical efficiency. The ship began to list and settle. The order to abandon ship was given, but the speed of the sinking and the damage to the vessel's structure meant that the evacuation was chaotic, incomplete, and in many cases impossible. Lifeboats were lowered. Some reached the water intact and filled with survivors. Others were damaged or capsized or could not be launched because the ship's list made the davits inoperable. People jumped into the sea. People were thrown into the sea. People who had been below decks when the torpedo struck never reached the decks at all. The Irish Sea in October is not the North Atlantic in winter, but it does not need to be. The water temperature was cold enough to kill through hypothermia within an hour. The people in the water were wearing the clothes they had boarded in, traveling clothes, uniforms, coats, boots. They were not equipped for immersion. They had boarded a mailboat, not a life raft. Many of them could not swim. Some were injured by the explosion. Some were trapped below. Some reached the water alive and died there, in the slow, exhausting way that cold water kills. The body's core temperature dropping, the muscles failing, consciousness narrowing, the sea taking what the torpedo had not. The Linster sank within minutes of the second torpedo strike. The speed of the sinking was a significant factor in the death toll, because it meant that the evacuation could never be completed. There was not enough time to launch all the boats. There was not enough time to get all the passengers on deck. There was not enough time for the kind of orderly, disciplined abandonment that peacetime safety procedures imagined. The ship went down, and the people who were still aboard went down with it, and the people who were in the water were left to the cold and the current and the hope that rescue vessels would arrive before the sea finished what the torpedo had started. The sinking was fast. The Linster went down within minutes of the second torpedo strike. Some accounts say 10 minutes, some say 15, some say less. The speed of the sinking was the single most devastating factor in the death toll because it meant that the evacuation could never be completed. There was not enough time to launch all the lifeboats. There was not enough time to get all the passengers on deck. There was not enough time for the kind of orderly, disciplined abandonment that peacetime safety drills imagined and that wartime reality mocked. The ship was going down, and the angle of its descent was changing by the second, and the people still aboard were making decisions, conscious or instinctive, rational or panicked, that would determine whether they lived or died, and those decisions were being made in conditions that no amount of preparation could have replicated. Some people jumped. Some people were thrown into the water by the force of the ship's final movements. Some people went down with the vessel because they were below decks, or trapped or injured, or simply could not reach a way out before the sea came in. The rescue effort began almost immediately. Naval vessels, patrol boats, fishing craft from Kingstown and the surrounding coast all responded. But the rescuers arrived to a scene of profound distress. Bodies in the water, some alive and some not, wreckage, overturned lifeboats, people clinging to debris, and the vast, indifferent surface of the Irish Sea absorbing it all. The final death toll, as calculated by researchers associated with the National Maritime Museum of Ireland, stands at no fewer than 564 people. That figure makes the Leinster sinking the single greatest loss of life in the Irish Sea and one of the deadliest maritime disasters of the entire war. It is a number that resists comprehension unless you force yourself to think about it in human terms. 564 individual lives, each one with a name, each one with a family, each one with a reason for being on that particular boat on that particular morning. Soldiers who were going back to their units, postal workers who were carrying the mail, servants who were accompanying their employers, civilians who were visiting relatives or conducting business or simply crossing from one island to the other, and one unmarried daughter of a duke, traveling with her cook and her maid, making a journey that she had no reason to believe would be her last. Phyllis did not survive. Martha Bridge did not survive. Eleanor Strachan did not survive. The three women from the Abercorn household went into the Irish Sea together, and the sea did not return them. The exact circumstances of their deaths, whether they were killed by the force of the explosion, whether they made it to the deck, whether they reached the water alive, whether they found a lifeboat that subsequently capsized, whether they died of exposure or drowning or injury sustained in the initial blast, are not recorded with the precision that a family as prominent as the Abercorns might, in other circumstances, have been able to establish. The sinking was too fast, the death toll too large, the confusion too complete for individual narratives to be reconstructed with confidence from the available evidence. What is known is that Phyllis Hamilton, daughter of the second Duke of Abercorn, goddaughter of Queen Alexandra, the woman who had stayed inside the family orbit for 42 years without marriage or children or an independent trajectory of her own, died on the RMS Linster in the Irish Sea on October 10, 1918. The armistice that would end the war was 32 days away. It came too late for Phyllis, as it came too late for Arthur, as it came too late for 563 other people on that ship who had expected to reach the other side. There is something about the manner of Phyllis's death that concentrates everything this story has been building toward. She was not killed in battle. She was not killed by illness. She was not killed in a way that the family's culture of service and sacrifice could absorb into its existing language of noble loss. Arthur's death at Ypres, for all its devastation, could be narrated within the framework the Abercorn world understood. A soldier, a battle, a regiment, a memorial. The family had a vocabulary for that kind of death. It had been using it for generations. Phyllis's death offered no such framework. She was a civilian on a mailboat. She was a woman traveling with her cook and her servant. She was not serving the crown. She was not fulfilling a military obligation. She was simply crossing the Irish Sea, doing one of the mundane things that people in her world did, and a torpedo killed her. The randomness of it and the sheer grinding contingency of being on that boat on that morning resisted every attempt to give it meaning. There was no regiment to mourn her. There was no memorial gate to inscribe her name among the honored dead. There was only the fact that she had been there, and now she was not, and that the same fact applied to 563 other people whose names meant nothing to the Abercorn family and everything to their own. The contrast between Phyllis's life and Phyllis's death is where the documentary's central thesis becomes most visible, not as an argument the narrator imposes, but as a pattern the story itself reveals. She had lived the most contained, most dutiful, most invisible life that the Abercorn system could produce. She had not married. She had not had children. She had not built a career or pursued an ambition or made a public mark of any kind. She had not challenged the family. She had not embarrassed the family. She had not done anything that required the family to notice her as anything other than a presence, a daughter in the drawing room, a companion at court, a figure in the carriage, a name on the household roster. She had stayed, and staying was her function, and the function was performed so quietly that the performance itself became a kind of disappearance. And then she died in the most public, most chaotic, most indiscriminate way possible. Not as a duchess's daughter in a private bedchamber, not as an aristocratic woman fading decorously from view inside the walls of a great house, but as one body among hundreds in a mass casualty maritime disaster that was reported on the front pages of every newspaper in the kingdom. The privacy that had defined her entire life was obliterated by the manner of her death. The invisibility that had been her condition for 42 years was reversed, brutally and completely, by a German torpedo. In death, Phyllis Hamilton became more visible than she had ever been permitted to be in life. The newspapers printed her name. The casualty lists recorded her loss. The public knew that the Duke of Abercorn's sister had perished on the Linster, and the bitter irony was that the attention arrived only because she was dead. Because the one thing Phyllis did that the world considered noteworthy was to die in a way that could not be absorbed into the family's private silence. For Mary, The news of the Linster sinking would have arrived in the way that catastrophic news arrived in Ireland in 1918. First as rumor, then as headline, then as the terrible suspended hours of not knowing, then as confirmation. The sinking was reported immediately. It was front-page news across Britain and Ireland. The scale of the disaster, hundreds dead on a mail boat within sight of the Irish coast, in the last weeks of a war that was supposed to be ending, provoked a reaction that went beyond the ordinary wartime response to casualty lists. This was not a battle in a distant field. This was a sinking in home waters on a route that connected Dublin to London, on a ship that ordinary people took to visit family or conduct business or simply to cross from one side of the Irish Sea to the other. The public outrage was enormous. The grief was communal. The newspapers published names as they became available, and the families of the dead waited, and some for days, some for weeks, to learn whether their people had survived. Mary would have waited too. The Dowager Duchess of Abercorn, sitting in whatever house she occupied in those days, whether Baron's Court or a London residence or some other corner of the family's property, would have heard the news and known before any confirmation arrived that her daughter had been on that ship. She would have known because she would have known Phyllis's travel plans. She would have known because a mother knows where her children are. And she would have waited for the confirmation that came, eventually, with the finality that all such confirmations carry. Phyllis was dead. Martha Bridge was dead. Eleanor Strachan was dead. The 3 women from the Abercorn household had gone into the Irish Sea and would not be coming back. Mary was 69 years old. She had now lost 7 of her 9 children, 4 infant sons dead in the nursery before any of them reached an age where memory could properly hold them. A husband dead at 74, taking with him the center of gravity around which her entire adult life had been organized. Arthur dead at Ypres, his body unrecovered, his name inscribed on a wall in Belgium alongside tens of thousands of others. Glattis dead at 36, in circumstances that the family's silence continues to guard. And now Phyllis, the daughter who had stayed, the daughter who had never left the family orbit, the daughter who had been present when everyone else had been deployed or married off or killed, dead on a mailboat in the Irish Sea, with the cook and the servant who had been her daily companions in a life defined by the absence of anything more intimate. The arithmetic does not bear thinking about, but it must be thought about because arithmetic is what dynasties are built on. 9 children born to the Duchess of Abercorn for the continuation of one of the grandest houses in the British Isles. 4 dead in infancy, 1 killed at Ypres, 1 dead in her 30s under circumstances the family chose to keep private, 1 drowned in the Irish Sea. 2 sons remaining. The heir survived, the spare survived, every other child was gone. The immediate aftermath of the Linster sinking was, for the families of the dead, a period of administrative anguish overlaid on grief that the administrative language could not begin to address. Bodies were recovered from the sea over the following days by rescue vessels, naval craft, and fishing boats operating out of Kingstown and the surrounding harbors. But not all bodies were recovered. The sea does not return everything it takes, and some of the Leinster's passengers were never found, lost to the current, to the depth, to the sheer indifference of cold water to human identity. The process of identification was complicated by the scale of the disaster, the condition of the remains, and the chaotic circumstances of the sinking itself. Some of the dead were identified by documents found on their persons. Some were identified by personal effects, rings, watches, items of clothing. Some were identified only by the process of elimination. They had been on the passenger list, they had not appeared among the survivors, and therefore they were presumed dead. For a family like the Abercorns, the practical dimensions of the disaster would have been managed by the machinery that managed everything in the household's contact with the outside world. Solicitors, agents, secretaries, the network of intermediaries that shielded a ducal family from the raw mechanics of bureaucracy. Letters would have been written, inquiries would have been made. The family's name and the family's connections would have been deployed in the effort to recover Phyllis's body and to ensure that whatever could be done was done with the decorum and efficiency that the household demanded. But the practical arrangements, however competently they were handled, did not address the thing that no arrangement could reach. Phyllis was dead, the cook was dead, the servant was dead, and no amount of ducal authority could retrieve them from the Irish Sea. The Abercorn household had, by this point, more experience with grief than any household should ever accumulate. It had been processing loss since the early 1870s, when the first infant son died and Mary began, the long education in bereavement that would continue for nearly 5 decades. But the Linster was different from every loss that had preceded it, and the difference was not merely emotional, it was structural, it was public. Every earlier death in this story had been, to a greater or lesser degree, contained within the family's control. The infant deaths, private and domestic, the second Duke's death, ceremonial and expected, Arthur's death absorbed into the honorable framework of military sacrifice, Glattis's death guarded by a silence that the family imposed and that the historical record has so far respected. The family had been able to choose, within the conventions of their world, how each loss was presented and how each loss was mourned. The Linster destroyed that control. Phyllis's death was sudden, violent, random, and reported in every newspaper in the kingdom. The Dowager Duchess of Abercorn's daughter had perished in a torpedo attack on a mail boat alongside hundreds of other people. Soldiers, postal workers, servants, civilians, children. The family's private grief was now inescapably public property. The name Abercorn appeared in the Linster casualty lists alongside the names of men and women who would never have found themselves in the same room as a duke's daughter in life. In death, the title that had separated the Hamiltons from ordinary Irish experience for 3 centuries could not separate Phyllis from ordinary Irish tragedy. She was one victim among 564. She was mourned by a duchess and mourned by a nation, and the two mournings had nothing in common except the dead. Inside the family, the loss rearranged everything that remained. The third duke was now the brother who had lost 2 siblings to the war. Arthur, to a German bullet at Ypres, Phyllis to a German torpedo in the Irish Sea, and a third sibling, Glattis, to causes the family kept private. His survival was no longer merely the expected outcome of being the heir. It was a fact that required a kind of reckoning, even if the reckoning was never conducted aloud. James Albert had inherited the title, the estate, the 76,000 acres, the political career, and the future. Arthur had inherited the Menin Gate. Phyllis had inherited the Irish Sea. Glattis had inherited silence. The system had worked exactly as it was supposed to work. The name survived, the house survived, the estate survived, the heir survived, and the children who were not essential to that survival, the younger son, the married daughter, the unmarried daughter, the 4 infant boys who never left the nursery, had been consumed, one by one, by the forces that the dynasty structure could not control and that its wealth could not deflect. Claude Nigel, the youngest, was now one of only 2 surviving children of the 9 Mary had borne. He had come through the war physically intact. That much the record confirms. What the record does not tell us is what kind of man emerged from the other side of those 4 years. He had lost Arthur. He had lost Glattis. He had lost Phyllis. He had lost a father who had been the center of the household and the mother's composure that had, perhaps, been the center of everything else. He was 29 years old. He was unmarried. He had no estate, no political career, no obvious future beyond the one the family's pattern suggested: service, duty, the attachment to institutional life that Abercorn's sons defaulted to when the title and the acres belonged to someone else. He would never marry. He would never have children. He would spend the next 57 years in royal service, attached first to the household of George V, then to Queen Mary, then continuing into the reign of Elizabeth II, performing the quiet, invisible, essential duties that kept the monarchy's domestic machinery running. He would become, in a sense, the most faithful expression of the Abercorn principle, a son whose life was given entirely to the service of the crown, without reservation, without family of his own, without any of the visible markers of personal fulfillment that the modern world consider essential. Whether that life was a vocation or a refuge, whether Claude Nigel chose royal service because it suited him or because it was the only structure available to a man whose family had been destroyed and whose place in the world was defined by what he was not the heir, not the war dead, not the married son, not the father, is a question the public record cannot answer. It can only note that he served, and that he served for a very long time, and that he died in 1975 at the age of 86, alone in the way that unmarried, childless men are alone, carrying whatever he carried in the silence that his family and his era had taught him was the only acceptable response to things that could not be borne. Mary had 11 years of life remaining. She would die in 1929 at the age of 80, having outlived 7 of her 9 children. In the years between the Linster sinking and her own death, she would do what mothers in her position did, that she would continue. She would commission the memorial inside the Baronscourt Estate Church, the stone that bore Phyllis's name and Glattis's name together, carved by a mother's instruction and placed in the building where the family worshipped. She would watch her eldest son assume the role of first governor of Northern Ireland in 1922, the ceremonial head of a new political entity created from the partition of the island, the constitutional settlement that the family's unionism had fought for across generations, and that the family's suffering had, in some way that could never be calculated or acknowledged, helped to purchase. She would see Claude Nigel settle into royal service, quiet and unmarried, the last surviving echo of the generation she had brought into the world. The dynasty would continue, the title would continue, Baronscourt would continue, the valley, the great house, the parkland, the church with its memorial, the estate that had been the family's home since 1612 and that would remain the family's home long after every person in this story was dead. The system Mary had served would endure, as it was designed to endure, as it had always endured, absorbing loss and grief and catastrophe into its own continuity, without ever pausing to ask whether the continuity was worth the cost. But the question that this story must sit with, the question that gives the closing its weight and that the documentary must not answer too quickly or too neatly, is not whether the dynasty survived. Of course the dynasty survived. Dynasties are machines built for survival. The question is what kind of survival this was, what it meant for a system to function exactly as intended and still leave a trail of dead children behind it. What it meant for a mother to spend 50 years inside that system, providing it with the one thing it required, heirs, spares, alliances, continuity, and then to watch the system outlive almost everything she had given it. And what remains in the end when the name endures and the people who carried it do not. The armistice came on November 11th, 1918, 32 days after the Linster went down. The guns stopped on the Western Front. The bells rang in London and Belfast and Dublin and in the village churches of County Tyrone. The war that had consumed 10 million lives was over, and the world that emerged from it was altered in ways that would take years to fully comprehend. For the Abercorn family, the armistice arrived as a fact rather than a release. The war was over. Arthur was still dead. Phyllis was still dead. Glattis was still dead. The end of the fighting did not reverse the losses. It merely stopped the accumulation of new ones. Mary entered the post-war years as a woman whose public identity had been overtaken entirely by what she had lost. She was the Dowager Duchess of Abercorn, a title that, by 1919, meant less to the world than the fact that she was the mother who had buried 7 of her 9 children. The infant sons had been private losses, absorbed into the household's rhythms decades earlier, mourned and folded into the domestic silence that the Victorian nursery maintained around its dead. But Arthur, Glattis, and Phyllis had been adult children. People with names and faces and voices that the wider family and the wider social world remembered. People who had occupied specific positions inside the Abercorn machinery and whose absence left specific gaps that could not be filled by continuity or ceremony. Their deaths, arriving in the concentrated span between 1914 and 1918, had given Mary's story a shape that no amount of ducal composure could soften. She was not merely a bereaved mother. She was the particular, documented example of what happened when a dynasty's reproductive demands met a century's capacity for destruction. She had done everything the family asked. She had married well. She had produced 9 children across 20 years. She had appeared at court, served the Queen, managed one of the grandest households in Ireland, and raised her surviving children inside the framework of duty and service that the Abercorn name required. And the dynasty had used those children, used them for inheritance, for military service, for matrimonial alliance, for domestic attendance, and given back, in the end, 2 surviving sons and a plaque on a church wall. The years between 1919 and Mary's death in 1929 are, in the public record, quiet years, the kind of years that do not generate dramatic documentation, because dramatic events have ceased to occur. What they generate instead is the slow, unremarkable evidence of a woman living out the final decade of her life inside a family that had moved beyond her. The household was the third Duke's household now. The decisions were the third Duke's decisions. The political future was the third Duke's to navigate. The next generation of Abercorn children, James Albert's children with Rosalind, were growing up at Baronscourt, filling the rooms that Mary's children had once occupied, absorbing the same lessons about duty and service and the primacy of the name. Mary's role was to occupy the space the family reserved for its widowed mothers, honored, respected, consulted on matters of tradition and domestic memory, and fundamentally peripheral to everything that determined the household's direction. That peripherality should not be mistaken for peace. A woman does not bury 7 children and then find peace. She finds, at best, a way of carrying the weight that does not cause her to collapse in public. Mary continued. She attended family occasions. She occupied her position within the household's hierarchy of precedence. She worshipped in the estate church, where the memorial to her daughters stood. She was 80 years old when she died in 1929, 50 years after her first infant son had been buried, 16 years after her husband's death, 15 years after Arthur was killed at Ypres, 12 years after Glattis died, 11 years after Phyllis drowned in the Irish Sea. The obituaries noted her rank, her court service, and her connection to the Abercorn name. They did not attempt to narrate the private arithmetic that had structured her life, because the private arithmetic was not the kind of material that obituaries in the court circular were designed to contain. The third Duke, meanwhile, was building the most consequential public career any Abercorn had ever had, not because he sought prominence in the way that ambitious politicians seek it, but because the political upheaval of post-war Ireland demanded exactly the kind of figure he had spent his life becoming. James Albert Edward Hamilton had been raised inside the Unionist establishment. He had absorbed its assumptions. He had mastered its language. He had married into its network. He had sat on the correct committees and attended the correct gatherings, and maintained the family's position inside the interconnected world of the Orange Order, the landed gentry, and the conservative politics that bound Ulster Protestantism to the British state. When the Government of Ireland Act of 1920 partitioned the island and created the new entity of Northern Ireland, with its own devolved parliament at Stormont, its own prime minister, its own machinery of self-governance within the United Kingdom, the question of who would serve as its first governor was answered with the inevitability that had characterized every major appointment in the Abercorn story for 3 generations. The third Duke was appointed in 1922. He was 52 years old, the son of a Duke who had governed through courtly service, the grandson of a Duke who had governed through viceregal office. The pattern was unbroken. There is something about that appointment that encapsulates the central dynamic this story has been tracking. The family had lost children to war, to the sea, to illness, to the indiscriminate cruelty of infant mortality. It had lost its patriarch. It had watched the old political world of landlord Ireland disintegrate and be replaced by a partitioned state whose existence confirmed that the era of Anglo-Irish grandeur was over. And yet the heir, the son for whom the entire system had been constructed, the child whose survival the dynasty had prioritized above all others, emerged from the wreckage, not diminished but elevated. He was no longer merely the Duke of Abercorn, master of Baronscourt, one of the great landed magnates of Ulster. He was the first governor of Northern Ireland, the visible ceremonial embodiment of unionist authority in a new constitutional arrangement that had been purchased, at least in part, by the blood and grief of the generation that preceded him. The system had done what it was designed to do. It had protected the heir, it had failed to protect the others, and it had delivered the surviving eldest son into a position of prominence that exceeded anything his father or grandfather had held. The name was not merely intact. It was, in the narrow political sense, that the governor's office represented, more powerful than it had ever been. James Albert served as governor until 1945, a tenure of 23 years that spanned the establishment of the Northern Ireland state, the economic depression of the 1930s, and the Second World War. His wife, Rosalind, became the woman who stabilized the line. She managed the household. She raised the next generation of Abercorn children. She kept the domestic machinery of Baronscourt running, while her husband occupied the most visible ceremonial role in Ulster. Rosalind's presence in this story is quiet but essential because she did what Mary had done a generation earlier. She married into the dynasty, produced heirs, and subordinated her private life to the family's public demands. But she did it inside a house that bore the scars of the woman who came before her. She worshipped in the same church. She walked the same corridors. And she would have seen, every time she entered the estate chapel, the memorial that her mother-in-law had placed there, the names of the daughters who did not survive, carved into the wall by the instruction of a woman who had run out of other ways to hold them. Claude Nigel's trajectory through the post-war decades confirmed, with a steadiness that bordered on the monastic, the pattern that had governed his life since boyhood. The spare son, the useful son, the son who served because service was the only structure the family had offered him, and because perhaps service was the only structure that could hold together a man whose family had been taken apart. He entered the household of George V shortly after the war and remained in royal service through the death of that king and the accession of his successor, through the abdication crisis and the coronation of George VI, through the Second World War and the post-war transformation of Britain, and into the reign of Elizabeth II. His career spanned the decline of the empire, the dismantling of the old aristocratic world, and the creation of a modern constitutional monarchy that bore little resemblance to the court that his mother had served as lady-in-waiting half a century earlier. He never married. He never had children. He never, so far as the public record shows, published a memoir or gave an interview or offered any account of what his life had contained beyond the facts that the court circulars recorded. Duties performed, functions attended, service rendered. He was by every available measure the most faithful expression of the Abercorn principle. A son whose entire adult existence was given to the institutions his family served, without reservation, without visible complaint, and without any of the personal markers that the modern world considers essential to a fully realized life. He died in 1975 at the age of 86. He was the last of Mary's children to die. He had outlived every one of his 8 siblings, the 4 infant brothers he never knew, the heir who governed Northern Ireland for 23 years, the soldier who fell at Ypres, the married sister who died in 1917, and the unmarried sister who drowned in the Irish Sea. He carried all of them with him, in whatever way a man carries the dead, through 61 years of quiet service in rooms where no one asked him about the weight. No major film, television series, or literary dramatization has been built around the specific story of Mary Anna Curzon-Howe and her children. That absence is itself a kind of evidence of how deeply this story has been buried inside the larger narratives that the Abercorn name generates. The family's later public life is well documented through political biography, institutional history, and the ongoing life of the Baronscourt estate. The third Duke appears in histories of Northern Ireland as a political figure. The dukedom appears in books on the peerage and the great Anglo-Irish estates. The estate appears in heritage guides and commercial directories. But the private narrative of the mother who lost 7 children, the story of Mary, and of what the dynasty cost the woman who supplied it with the one thing it could not manufacture for itself, has not been extracted from the larger record and told as the human story it is. The family appears in reference as a political entity, as a landed estate, as a piece of the Ulster Unionist tradition. It does not appear as what it also was, a household in which a woman spent half a century producing children for a dynasty and watching the dynasty outlive almost every one of them. The RMS Linster itself occupies a similarly overlooked position in public memory. It was the greatest maritime disaster in Irish waters and one of the deadliest of the entire First World War. Yet it carries nothing like the cultural recognition of the Lusitania or the Titanic. Researchers and memorial organizations, particularly the Linster Memorial Project and the National Maritime Museum of Ireland, have worked to preserve the memory of the sinking and its victims, but the disaster remains, in the broader public consciousness, a largely forgotten catastrophe. It was overshadowed first by the armistice that followed it by 32 days, then by the revolutionary upheaval that consumed Ireland in the years immediately after the war, and then by the passage of time and the relentless competition for memorial space that characterizes any period so saturated with loss. The fact that Phyllis Hamilton's death occurred inside this largely forgotten disaster is consistent with the life she led. She was invisible in life. She is nearly invisible in historical memory. The Linster took her, and the public memory of the Linster faded, and Phyllis faded with it. The daughter who stayed, swallowed by a catastrophe that the world has mostly chosen not to remember. That absence of prior dramatization is, for this documentary, an opportunity rather than a limitation. This story has not been flattened into a familiar prestige drama template. It has not been simplified into a redemptive arc with a consoling conclusion. It still feels like what it is: hidden material, private history, a family's real story told for the first time not as political biography or estate history, but as the account of what it cost a single woman to give her life to a name. What remains is this: the dukedom continues. The title has passed from the third Duke to the fourth, and from the fourth to the fifth Duke of Abercorn, and Baronscourt remains the family seat, a working estate in County Tyrone that still presents itself publicly as the home of the Duke of Abercorn's family since 1612. The language on the estate's own materials has barely changed across the centuries. A valley, a great house, continuity, heritage, land managed across generations. The deer park is still there. The woodlands are still managed on the long timescales that the family has always used, planting trees that the next generation will harvest, harvesting trees that the previous generation planted. The church on the estate grounds still stands, stone and slate, in the particular quiet of a building that has served the same family's worship for 400 years. And inside that church, the memorial that Mary commissioned remains in place. The names of Lady Phyllis Hamilton and Lady Glattis Hamilton, carved by their mother's instruction, visible to anyone who enters, enduring in the way that cut stone endures while the people it commemorates do not. The estate has adapted, as all surviving Anglo-Irish estates have had to adapt, to a world that no longer sustains aristocratic land ownership in the form that the first Duke would have recognized. Baronscourt operates as a rural business. Forestry, accommodation, country sports, award-winning food production. The language of continuity that once justified the family's political authority now forms part of its commercial identity, a selling point for visitors and customers who are drawn to the idea of a place with roots that stretch back to the 17th century. The great house is no longer the administrative center of a landlord empire governing 76,000 acres of Tyrone and Donegal. The acreage has diminished. The political authority has evaporated. The tenantry is gone. What remains is the house, the valley, the name, and the particular kind of permanence that attaches to families who kept their ground through centuries of upheaval and emerged, reduced but recognizable, into the modern world. What the name does not immediately convey, and what it takes a story like this one to uncover, and is the cost of that permanence. 9 children born to Mary Anna Curzon-Howe between 1869 and 1889. 4 dead in infancy, their lives so brief that the public record scarcely acknowledges them as lives at all. 1 killed at Ypres in 1914, his name on the Menin Gate, his body never recovered. 1 dead in 1917 under circumstances the family chose to guard with silence. How 1 drowned on the RMS Linster in 1918, 32 days before the end of the war, alongside the cook and the servant who were the nearest thing she had to companions. 2 sons surviving, the Duke who became governor of Northern Ireland and the courtier who served 4 monarchs and died unmarried at 86. The mother outlived 7 of her children and spent her final decade inside the house that had demanded them, worshipping in the church where their names were cut into the wall. The Menin Gate still stands in Ypres, bearing Arthur's name among the 55,000. The Baronscourt Church still stands, bearing the memorial Mary placed inside it. The estate still stands, with the valley and the parkland and the trees that were planted by people who believed the family would endure forever. All of it endures. The stone endures, the land endures, the title endures, the children do not. This story is not about whether rank failed to protect the Abercorns. Of course it did not. Wealth and title have never protected anyone from grief. What they do is make grief more ceremonial, more contained, more orderly from the outside, and more isolating from within. The tragedy of Mary Hamilton's family is that the dynasty worked exactly as it was supposed to work. The heir inherited, the estate endured, the public offices continued, the name passed from generation to generation without interruption, and still, child by child, year by year, the private world inside that name was thinned out until continuity itself became a form of silence. A great house in a green valley, a church with a memorial on the wall, and a mother who turned her daughters into stone because stone was the only thing she could give them that would last. If you found this story worth your time, please like and subscribe so you never miss another.